Not many people know this, but in the 1960s, three teenage sisters were imprisoned in their own house for a decade by their father and forced to start a rock band because of a prophecy that they would become world-famous musicians that his mother told him as a child. And the craziest thing about the story is that the prophecy came true. Do you believe in destiny? Have you ever felt somewhere in the furthest, most abstract corners of your mind that there's something more out there for you? That you're not where you're supposed to be? What did you do with that feeling? Did you let it sit there and fester, internalize it, allow it to morph into bitterness and despair? Does it still sit with you now, tuned out but always jabbing like a hot spur at the haunches of your soul? Or have you spent every waking moment living in pursuit of that voice? Do you live each day with uncompromising dedication to choking it silent and still? How far would you go for it? Would you hurt people along the way? Betty, Helen, and Dorothy Wiggin grew up in the 1960s in a working-class family from Fremont, New Hampshire. But wait, that's not the beginning of the story. We'll return to them later. Let's go back further to the 1930s. Austin Wiggin, the girl's father, was also growing up in New Hampshire. As a kid, Austin's mother was highly superstitious. She was also an amateur palm and tarot reader. One day, she read Austin's palms and made 3 bold predictions for his future. He would marry a strawberry blonde woman, have 2 sons that their grandmother wouldn't live to see, and would have 3 daughters who would be in a massively successful music group, which is a much bolder claim than the other 2, but let's run with it. It's unclear what Austin thought of these predictions at the time, but years later, after he'd married his wife, Annie, who was indeed a strawberry blonde, and then his mother passed away, and then he had 2 sons, and then 4 daughters, one thing became singularly clear to him. These weren't just the idle guesses of a superstitious old tarot hobbyist. It was a prophecy from a woman who was off by 1, but doesn't matter. Austin had always been an oppressively strict parent. The Wiggin sisters spent most of their childhood largely cut off from the outside world, not allowed to socialize or even listen to music or watch movies. But at least they could go to school and get out of the house to see friends. That all changed around 1964 when Austin realized that his daughters were selected by God himself to become a world-famous band. Considering that none of the girls had any musical experience playing instruments, singing, or writing songs, and especially since they had grown up not being allowed to listen to music, so they kinda didn't even know what it was or how it worked, Austin knew that they would have to work hard if they wanted to become the next big thing. So he pulled them out of school, completely shut them off from the outside world, bought them all cheap used instruments from a pawn shop, and began the 5-year grueling process of turning these teenage girls who hadn't even really heard much music before into a world-famous rock band. And what was that band called? He named them the Shaggs, a reference to a hairstyle that was popular at the time. So, how do you wrench the world's next biggest musical group out of the ether? Well, according to Austin, it was taking them out of school, enrolling them in a mail-order Chicago homeschool system called American Homeschool, keeping them locked inside of the house 24/7 and not allowed to see the outside world, having band practice from sunup to sundown 7 days a week, doing calisthenics right before bed, going to sleep, waking up, and repeating. 5 years. For 5 years, these girls had band practice from 8 to 10 hours a day, never saw anybody from the outside world, and lived every minute of their lives in service of this bizarre fixation their father had with them becoming the new Beatles. So what was a day in the life of the Wiggins during this time? Was it the platonic ideal of the family band depicted in the Partridge Family? Or was it more like the Manson family? Austin Wiggin ran a tight household. In the Wiggin home, it was his way or the highway, and he did not suffer any pushback, complaining, or disrespect towards his cherished prophecy. And the only way you get your wife and 6 kids to all agree to spend 5 years writing and practicing songs in the hopes that one day it'll all suddenly pay off and you'll no longer be a lower middle-class family from ass end to nowhere, New Hampshire, is by ruling with an iron fist and building a household dynamic where everyone, including your wife, is scared to go against anything you say for fear of your wrath. The Wiggin girls describe this period of their lives as bleak and devoid of any enjoyment. Days dragged on for them as they did nothing but practice music that they didn't even want to be playing in the first place. No friends, no boyfriends, no malt shops or drive-ins, no dances. Not even any normal day-to-day stuff like reading books or watching TV. Just practicing, practicing in calisthenics. They've said that they couldn't decide which was worse, the days they had to do calisthenics, or the days Austin decided that instead of doing calisthenics, they should just practice music for another hour before bed. So, what exactly was the Shaggs as a band? What were they doing for all those hours locked up in the basement practicing? Dot and Betty both played guitar, and Helen played the drums. Dot wrote all the songs, from the lyrics to the melodies, and Betty helped her out with developing the melodies. Austin was their harshest critic, mercilessly ripping apart their songs and forcing them to perform them for him over and over again until he felt like they had finally gotten them right, which he never did. The whole thing was somehow like a sadder and more abusive version of that movie Whiplash, except for if J.K. Simmons' character had yanked Miles Teller's character out of school and forced him at gunpoint to try and become a jazz drummer and then threw a chair at his head. Their lives were not their own. They were avatars for somebody else's inner demons being worked out in real time. They were not a band. They were somebody else's clenching heart. At one point, however, practicing wasn't enough. Austin realized that the girls needed to get some real-world experience. They needed to play shows. Concert events were not common in small-town New Hampshire, and it was going to be a challenge to get enough people to come out and see an amateur band full of local teenagers, but Austin was nothing if not pragmatic. Their first performance was at a talent show in a nearby town in 1968. Up until this point, the girls had been performing in a vacuum. No audience to give them feedback, and no real frame of reference for what good, popular music even sounded like. Well, on this night, the vacuum was ripped wide open. They went on stage and jangled out a few cover songs on their out-of-tune instruments and were met with jeers, boos, and even soda cans being thrown at them. They already hated playing the music and being in the band, and now they had even more of a reason to hate it. Whatever dim illusion that they were actually going to be big stars their father gaslit them into believing during those long days practicing in their house was shattered that night. They were more miserable than they ever were. What was Austin's answer to the crushing feelings of humiliation and defeat the girls felt on that night? They just needed to go home and practice more. Because the thing is that Austin took that age-old adage, practice makes perfect, literally. He believed that endless repetition would have a mathematical termination point at which the Shaggs would become great. Young group of girls plus relentless practice equals fame and fortune. And in a way, he was right. This is how you accomplish greatness. You push until you're exhausted, fed up, and completely drained. And then you keep pushing until you feel on the verge of utter collapse. And then you push just a little bit more. His one fatal mistake was failing to realize that there's another vital ingredient to the recipe that is required to make all of the practice mean something. Passion. None of them had it. Not even Austin himself, who was described by his daughters as not particularly liking music before he became obsessed with him outselling Elvis or whatever. At this point, life for Betty, Helen, and Dot was a never-ending feedback loop of pain, boredom, and personal humiliation. Their days stretched on into infinity, practicing music they didn't care about, only to be punctuated by the occasional shame of having to perform in front of a group of kids they desperately wish they could just be friends with. The next show the girls played was a nursing home on Halloween night, because, you know, trick-or-treating would be too fun. They played a set featuring a new song that Dot wrote called It's Halloween, which is easily the best song on their first album, and also just barely edges out This Is Halloween as the greatest song about how it's currently Halloween. At least this time they didn't have to embarrass themselves in front of a bunch of peers. The elderly nursing home patients were kinder and politely clapped after the performance. This show felt less like a walk through a social life-ending gauntlet over hot coals, and more like a patronizing grandma complimenting your refrigerator artwork. But this was only the beginning for the girls, because Austin had finally found a golden opportunity to put the Shaggs in the spotlight. The town of Fremont was looking to host a regular get-together for the local youth, something to keep them from getting into trouble, running with the wrong crowds, and devolving into a debaucherous life of crime. Every Saturday night, they were going to transform the town hall into a big dance for all the teens in Fremont, full of food, age-appropriate drinks, and live music. Austin was in the right place at the right time and negotiated for the Shaggs to become the resident house band for the event. This became a regular part of life for the Wiggin sisters. For years, they had only ventured into the outside world to go grocery shopping on Friday nights, attend Sunday Mass, and occasionally sneak out of the house to swim in a nearby watering hole when their father was at work. In any other circumstance, hanging out with the entirety of the teenage population in town every single week would have been an exciting new chapter in their lives. But for Betty, Helen, and Dot, it just became another source of trauma. If they weren't already, they became the local laughingstock of their peer group in town. Kids went to either openly mock them in their music or were just annoyed that their racket was ruining an otherwise enjoyable party. Up until this point, the Shaggs and the Wiggin family existed as an odd blip in the periphery of the social scene in Fremont. Austin was a private person and didn't make a habit of bragging or doing much socializing in town at all. And considering the isolationist nature of what the family was doing, it's possible that nobody was even aware of the existence of this band until the town hall shows. But after the shows became a regular occurrence, the town started talking. Austin became an elusive, enigmatic, and scandalous figure. Word spread of how he kept his daughters locked away in a basement and forced them to practice music. There was even a rumor that persisted in town that Austin was carrying on incestuous relationships with his daughters. But what the town saw as a bizarre, concerning, possibly illicit situation, Austin Wiggin saw as the beginning of a meteoric rise to fame. After a few months of the town hall shows, he decided that he couldn't just sit around and wait for the girls to be discovered, like he'd been assuming would inevitably happen. In order for the prophecy to be fulfilled, he'd have to carry the Shaggs across the finish line himself. He decided it was time for the girls to cut an album. In March of 1969, 5 years after he'd pulled the girls out of school and handed them musical instruments, he rented out a day at Fleetwood Studios in Revere, Massachusetts, for the Shaggs to record their first LP. A collection of tracks they'd been slowly writing, developing, and practicing for the last several years. There's not a lot of information about the first recording session, but an engineer at Fleetwood, Jeff Landrock, who ended up recording a second studio session in 1975, remembers the odd sight that the family struck and how utterly miserable and checked out the girls seemed. They didn't really seem enthusiastic, like they were doing something great. It was more like this was their chore. Like instead of washing dishes that night, they were recording an album, you know? So I just sort of set them up and live, and it was quite horrifying. Rewinding back to the original 1969 session, the engineer at the time, Bob Hearn, heard the songs that the Shaggs wanted to record and urged Austin to reconsider. He suggested that they go back and practice a little bit more before dropping the cash on laying down tape. The Shaggs were apparently so bad that a business said, "Please don't give us your money." However, Austin was not having it, and as he told Hearn, "I want to get them while they're hot." So Hearn promptly shrugged, took Austin's money, and recorded the Shaggs' debut and only album, The Philosophy of the World. This album defies any human being's capability, let alone mine, of describing things. But perhaps Austin Wiggin does it best in the liner notes included in the record sleeve. The Shaggs are real, pure, unaffected by outside influences. Their music is different. It is theirs alone. They believe in it, live it. Of all contemporary acts in the world today, perhaps only the Shaggs do what others would like to do, and that is perform only what they believe in, what they feel, not what others think the Shaggs should feel. The Shaggs love you. They will not change their music or style to meet the whims of a frustrated world. You should appreciate this because you know they are pure. What more can you ask? This reads like a news report from North Korea. However, it's odd how spot on and self-aware Austin is about some aspects of what he says, primarily in regards to how the Shaggs sound is untouched or informed by any outside influences. And as we'll discuss later, it's very interesting that he specifically chose to use the word outside in his description of the band. The album took all day to record, which was grueling for the girls, but is actually a very short amount of time to record an entire album. So how were they able to do it in that short amount of time? Because they did it all in one shot. While in the early days of recording, it was common for bands to record live in one room, and it still continues to be done in certain situations, by this time in the late 60s, it had become standard for recording studios to track instruments separately. The engineer was confused to find out that Austin wanted him to just set up a bunch of microphones in the room and let him go at it. He was also even more confused when he found out that Austin wasn't really interested in doing multiple takes of songs or trying to re-record or overdub mistakes. They got everything in nearly one take and were done, which is so odd that Austin was obsessed with grueling, repetitive rehearsal over a period of years, standing over his daughters and yelling at them to start over anytime they made the slightest mistake. And yet, when it was crunch time to actually immortalize the music on wax forever, he was just like, yeah, sounds fine, whatever. So, we've described in stunning, granular detail what the reaction to the Shaggs music was, but what do the Shaggs actually sound like? What's all the fuss about?
Oh, the rich people want what the poor people got, and the poor people want what the rich people got.
Everything from the physical playing of the music to the lyrics to the fact that the song structure consists of a series of guitar runs with the vocals exactly mimicking it while the drums hack away in the background, providing no actual rhythm for the song, hits you over the head with this aggressive expression of innocence. If it were trained musicians attempting the avant-garde, it'd be too performative. If it were little kids, it'd feel cute. But coming from Helen, Betty, and Dot at this point in their lives, considering that they were literally held prisoner by their obsessed father and forced to make it, the simplistic absurdity of every piece of the music feels profound. It's music from an alternate reality where music hadn't been invented yet in the 60s. It's a soundtrack for a post-apocalypse that happened exclusively in the Wiggin household. It's also brimming with this eerie feeling of deep sadness. The playing feels rushed and sloppy, like it's played by a child who just wants to get it over with so they can go home and go to sleep, which might be the only real peace they feel in their lives. And what's even sadder, the reason why it sounds like that is because that's literally what it is. However, their most definitive song is probably My Pal Foot, a song about Dot's lost cat, Foot, that is so genuinely bizarre in its atonality and abstract lyrical content that you could believe it was actually generated by a modern AI that had been fed 30 years worth of children's music and recordings of drum sets rolling down hills.
My pal's name is Foot, he always likes to roam. My pal's name is...
Based on everything you've heard so far, the entire story leading up to this, the way this music sounds, the tight control Austin Wiggin held over his daughters, and the way they look on their album cover, how old do you assume Helen, Betty, and Dot are? I wouldn't blame you for assuming they're young children. But what if I told you that at the time they recorded Philosophy of the World, Betty was 18, Dot was 21, and Helen was 22. 1,000 copies of Philosophy of the World were pressed by a record dealer in a nearby town, but Austin only received 100 of them. The other 900 copies, along with the money Austin paid as well as the shady record dealer, disappeared and were never seen again. But maybe those missing 900 copies of the album have something to do with the stuff we're going to discuss soon. However, back in 1969, Austin only had 100. He distributed them around to local radio stations, but ultimately got no play and no media attention. The girls continued to play the town hall shows, but years went by and the upward trajectory of the band completely stagnated. Nobody wanted to play their record, no record labels were coming to the town hall shows, and people ultimately just didn't care. And by 1973, the city decided to end the weekly town hall shows for undisclosed reasons. Austin no longer had a venue for the band, but he was still sure the girls would eventually make it. He kept forcing them to practice every day and have no social lives. He made them play shows wherever they could. He was white-knuckling his blind belief in the prophecy, but the walls were starting to close in around him. The periphery of doubt was coming into full view. The flames of mediocrity were licking at his feet. The voice in the back of his mind was taunting him. The girls were also starting to get tired of their father's oppressive rule. They were less and less willing to blindly submit to his every whim as they got older. However, no matter how fed up they got or how much they started testing the boundaries of rebellion, it's astounding how deferential and fearful of Austin's wrath they were so far into their 20s. Helen eventually met a boy at one of the town hall dances and secretly eloped with him behind her family's back. However, she was so utterly terrified of telling her dad that she ended up living at home, pretending like everything was completely normal for 3 whole months before finally working up the courage to tell her father that she had gotten married and kinda needed to go live with her husband. Austin promptly pulled out his shotgun and left to go track down the poor guy. Helen eventually left the Wiggin household and the tight clutches of Austin for the first time, and he didn't talk to her for months afterward, until he realized that nobody else could play the drums. Let me remind you that Helen was 28 years old at the time. In 1975, the Shaggs went back into Fremont studios to record another album. It was the only thing Austin could think of to do. They weren't getting any new gigs other than the occasional local fair or nursing home pity show that was essentially the equivalent of your grandma scrounging up a butter rum flavored lifesaver out of her purse to give to you. Radio stations wouldn't play Philosophy and nobody wanted to buy it. Maybe they just needed to record a new one. So they went in and recorded a bunch of new material. And as the new engineer, Jeff Landrock, recalls, they had majorly improved since the last session in 1969. They actually sounded like a real band who kinda knew what they were doing. However, they still weren't good enough, and Landrock again suggested to Austin that he shouldn't blow his hard-earned money on recording the material. Austin, once again, persisted. At this point, the fourth Wiggin sister, Rachel, had joined the band as the bassist. They still recorded the whole thing live in one shot, and the entire experience was once again bizarre and surreal for everyone involved, except for Austin, who was basically seeing everyone around him as anthropomorphic dollar signs and stars wearing sunglasses. The material from this session was never released, for reasons that will become clear very soon. But in the 80s, it eventually came out as a compilation of unreleased tracks called Shaggs' Own Thing. Here's some of the opening track, You're Something Special to Me.
You're something special to me. 2, 3, 4. The world is big, you're not so grand. Has to say you're quite the man. Oh.
The reason why the 1975 session was never released as an album is because that year, at 47 years old, 11 years into his grand quest to fulfill a prophecy his mom gave him as a boy, and after facing roadblock, after dead end, after plateau, after false start, and never getting to see that prophecy fulfilled, Austin Wiggin died of a massive heart attack in his sleep. Without the oppressive grip of their father to keep them in the pursuit of fame and fortune as a band that they never wanted to be in the first place, the Shaggs immediately disbanded. Helen was already living her new life with her husband. The rest of the Wiggin children followed suit, with the two brothers, Betty and Dot, all moving out and starting their own families as well. Austin's widow, Annie, the strawberry blonde that kick-started Austin's mother's prophecy, sold the house to another family. However, after a while, they started reporting experiences of seeing a ghostly figure of a man in the house. The experiences persisted, and the family decided to have the entire home demolished and built a new one on top of the property in order to rid themselves of what they genuinely believed to be the specter of Austin Wiggin. And that's that. The band was over, and the Wiggin sisters all moved on to normal working-class New England lives they all basically wanted from the very beginning. A decade passed, and the Shaggs just became a really weird thing that happened to them as kids. However, that was far from the end of the Shaggs for the Wiggin sisters or the world, and, spoiler alert, Austin's prophecy eventually gets fulfilled. Imagine that when you were a teenager, your mom or dad forced you to act in some humiliating home movies. I'm sure we've all experienced something like that. Somewhere in your garage is a tape that contains something that mortifies you every time your parents whip it out at holidays and get-togethers. But ideally, it just becomes a distant memory that you only occasionally are reminded of as a relic from your childhood. Now, imagine that a decade later, after you've long forgotten about it, suddenly Frank Zappa starts talking about how it's the greatest home movie of all time in nationally televised TV interviews. In the most quintessential personification of that scene from Back to the Future where Marty McFly noodles away at a hard rock guitar solo and is met with blank stares from the audience of 1950s high schoolers, only to say, I guess you're probably not ready for that yet, but your kids are gonna love it. Whenever the 1980s rolled around, people were ready for the Shaggs. There was no precedent set for the atonal, amusical, expressionist texture that Helen, Betty, and Dot were accidentally creating back in 1969. Sure, by that time we already had outsider artists and avant-garde composers like Arnold Schoenberg, Igor Stravinsky, John Cage, legendary Stardust Cowboy, The Residents, Wildman Fisher, Captain Beefheart, Ornette Coleman, and even Zappa himself. But they were all on the far fringes of culture. The Shaggs were trying to be a pop group, and people just thought their music was horrible and badly performed rock and roll. But the 1970s firmly transitioned experimental music into the mainstream. And in the 80s, Zappa had a genuine crossover hit with Valley Girl, and we also got Swordfish Trombones. Tom Waits spent the entire 70s establishing himself as a stool and piano jazz guy, only to hard left turn towards the avant-garde in the 80s in one of the most astonishing misdirective acts of implanting experimental thinking into a popular context of all time. There were more and more regular people getting into really weird experimental music by the day. It was no longer relegated to college radio stations, bargain bin vinyl crates, and the Dr. Demento show. People might not have been enjoying it for the right reasons, but it was getting out there. So, this is the context in which tiny mentions of the Shaggs started popping up here and there, much like a modern-day internet meme. It's not clear exactly how it started, but one of the loudest voices that stood was Frank Zappa, who started talking about the Shaggs in many of his television and radio interviews.
It's since become a minor hit on my show.
Well, let's pump it up, make it a major hit. I think it's time for a resurgence of the Shaggs, with the New Hampshire primary coming up and everything. Pump the Shaggs a little bit.
My pal, Foot.
Did I mention that Zappa said that Philosophy of the World was his third favorite album of all time? Not too bad for some teenagers from working class New Hampshire. Eventually, after the trickling up of the Shaggs into the zeitgeist of the late 70s, early 80s experimental music scene, Philosophy of the World ended up in the hands of members of the rock band NRBQ. The band, namely founding member Terry Adams, were transfixed by the album, and they happened to own their own indie record label called Red Rooster. They decided they wanted to reissue Philosophy of the World and set to work tracking down the remaining members. Our girls, Betty, Helen, and Dot. So where were they? Well, scattered across nearby towns around Fremont, married with teenage children. They'd long forgotten about the Shaggs. They'd sold all their musical equipment. They even had taken their husbands' last names, making it nearly impossible for Terry and the record label to track them down. They ended up going to the public library in Fremont and eventually were able to get phone numbers for the sisters. They met up with them and proposed the idea of reissuing Philosophy of the World on their record label. The sisters were confused, and it was clear that some level of PTSD bubbled up to the surface because they immediately started getting defensive about the proposition, asking how much it was going to cost them and what level of commitment they would have to make. Terry blew their minds when he told them that he was going to pay them and that they didn't have to lift a finger. Philosophy of the World was reissued in 1980 on vinyl and was immediately a hit in the indie and experimental scene. Word of mouth about the album spread like wildfire, with many fans discovering it playing in hip record stores at the time. Erwin Chussid, a music historian and inventor of the term, described the Shaggs as one of the first outsider rock artists, together with Wildman Fisher and Captain Beefheart. Outsider music is an offshoot of the outsider art movement. It's music created by self-taught or naive musicians. The term is usually applied to musicians from outside the music establishment who exhibit childlike qualities, and especially those who suffer from intellectual disabilities or mental illnesses, such as Wesley Willis or, of course, Daniel Johnston. And really, as much as the Shaggs were rediscovered and placed within the bucket of outsider music, they're such a personification of what outsider music is that the term might as well have been coined for them. Of all the musicians and composers who have been associated with the outsider movement throughout history, the Shaggs were the least compromised of experiments. Completely isolated from all secular pop culture throughout their childhoods, cut off from socializing with other people, left in a vacuum to basically invent music over again from scratch. As Austin Wiggin said all those years ago on the liner notes of Philosophy of the World, the Shaggs are real, pure, unaffected by outside influences. Their music is different. It is theirs alone. They believe in it, live it. Of all contemporary acts in the world today, perhaps only the Shaggs do what others would like to do. And that is perform only what they believe in, what they feel, not what others think the Shaggs should feel. It's almost like Austin Wiggin invented the concept of outsider music and not Erwin Chussid. The reaction to the Philosophy of the World was huge. No longer side-eyed as a sad bunch of untalented weirdos, the Shaggs' music was now being compared to the textural complexity of the free jazz movement of the early 1960s, spearheaded by alto saxophonist Ornette Coleman. One review by Lester Bangers in the Village Voice at the time said, "They recorded an album up in New England that can stand, I think, easily with Beatles 65, Life with the Lions, Blonde on Blonde, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks as one of the landmarks of rock and roll history. They can't play a lick, but mainly they got the right attitude, which is all rock and roll's ever been about from day one." Eventually, Kurt Cobain would say Philosophy was his 5th favorite album of all time. There was such a great response to the reissue of Philosophy that Terry and Red Rooster wanted to take those unreleased songs from the second studio session that the band did in 1975, as well as some unreleased tracks from the original 1969 session, and issue a compilation. The sisters agreed, and in 1982, the label released Shaggs' Own Thing. Own Thing isn't as highly regarded as Philosophy of the World, as a lot of people believe the recording lost the initial pure, raw innocence and creative spark that Philosophy had. The three sisters, for their part, each embodied a balanced spectrum of the feelings about this newfound interest in their music. Dot actually liked the idea of it and embraced the attention. Betty actively disliked anything that had to do with the Shaggs and had to be cajoled by Dot into signing contracts, speaking to record label people, or showing up for events. Helen couldn't care less either way. However, although these reissues and the ensuing explosion of popularity of the Shaggs in the indie and experimental music scene cemented them as a cult favorite in the early 80s, it never really affected the sisters much. They still lived in their regular lives in New Hampshire with their families, and in the 80s, before social media existed, they probably had no real idea of what was happening with their music and were able to forget about the Shaggs all over again. Years went by, and in 1999, the sisters were asked to perform as the Shaggs at NRBQ's 30th anniversary concert. Dot wanted to do it and convinced Betty to go along with her, but Helen was in poor health. She had been suffering from clinical depression for years, possibly as far back as her childhood in the 60s, living under her father's oppressive rule, and was not interested in ever doing anything Shaggs related again. So Betty and Dot performed at the concert, and shortly afterward, a feature story about them was written up in the New Yorker. This drummed up another wave of renewed interest in the Shaggs, and that same year, Irwin Chusid worked with them and RCA Victor to once again reissue Philosophy of the World, this time a remastered version based on the original master tapes that Dot had found in her closet a few years prior. In 2001, a Shaggs tribute album called Better Than the Beatles was released, featuring covers by artists like Ida, Octagonally Yours, R. Stevie Moore, Deerhoof, and Danielson Family. Tragically though, after years struggling with clinical depression and living on disability with dire health, Helen Wiggin passed away in 2005. Betty and Dot returned to their normal lives in New Hampshire, but Dot didn't want to completely give up this renewed life as a musician. And in 2013, she formed the Dot Wiggin Band with a handful of musicians that were Shaggs admirers. They released an album called Ready, Set, Go on Jello Biafra's indie label Alternative Tentacles. On the record, Dot writes and sings lyrics while being backed up by a band of professional musicians. It's not quite as interesting, charming, or unique as Philosophy of the World, but Dot says she has much more fun performing those songs than the old stuff.
She gets on her banana bike and pedals all around. She gets on her banana bike and travels through the town. There's just no stopping.
In 2017, Betty and Dot reunited and announced a reunion show. Along with a backing band, they performed all of the old Shaggs songs to delighted crowds of new and old fans.
I go to his house, knock at his door. People come out and say, foot, don't live here no more.
Throughout the years, the Shaggs have worked their way into pop culture in various ways. They've been referenced in film and TV, such as Gilmore Girls, Empire Records, and The Perks of Being a Wallflower. They boast celebrity fans, such as the band Guster and Men Who Stare at Goats author John Ronson. In 2011, a Shaggs musical was produced off-Broadway.
You're in a band? Like a rock band?
And a variety of people have covered their songs. At this point, the Shaggs' legacy in music history is firmly established, and they have a fairly large cult fan base. However, those fans are divided between the true fans who understand the pure, raw, emotional expression of innocence in the Shaggs' music. The fact that Philosophy of the World was birthed out of a once-in-a-lifetime coalescence of outsider divination and processing of deep trauma. And the people who just think it's fun to ironically listen to a weird band. Even the people who don't quite understand the appeal of the music probably wouldn't even understand the concept of outsider music if you tried to explain it to them. Have to admit that there's something about the record that makes it stand apart from just terrible music. Although he once actively tried to convince Austin not to record this music because he thought it was so bad, engineer of the Shaggs' Own Thing recordings, Jeff Landrock, now feels differently about the music he helped create.
I mean, I don't go around saying, hey, do you know the Shaggs? But it just comes up. I love the Shaggs. I love the Shaggs music. And there's been a lot of people who have tried to reproduce anything even coming close to what the Shaggs did. And it seems like nobody can do it.
But whether you think that the Wiggin sisters were musical geniuses accidentally tapping into a primordial reservoir of inner truth, or just some untalented young girls who were forced to make weird music by their controlling father, one thing is for sure. All those years ago, in the 1930s, Austin Wiggin's mother made a prediction that Austin would marry a strawberry blonde, have 2 sons, and then his daughters would become a huge music group. That prophecy stretched out through the next several decades, carried to a certain marker in the relay race by Austin himself. He probably died thinking that he had lived his life in vain, placing all of his hopes and dreams into a foolish prediction his crackpot mother made when he was a child. But little did he know, he wasn't meant to be the one to see the prophecy fulfilled. He wasn't destined to drag it screaming into existence. It was us, the fans, the weird, bearded dudes at record stores who played the album over the loudspeaker, the nerdy kids who stumbled across the LP searching through the stacks, or stumbled across a random video essay on the band on YouTube. It was always us who would help fulfill the prophecy. So, where does that leave the Shaggs themselves? This story is defined by 3 young girls dragged along on an adventure that wasn't theirs and they didn't want. And yet at the end of the day, it happened. They're the Shaggs now. They'll forever be inextricably woven into the fabric of music history, and their music will exist in the hearts of millions of experimental music fans. So how do they feel about that?
I still don't listen to it. My son listens to it.
Want the truth? I still don't think it's good.
Thank you for watching this video. This is another one that's really personal and I connect with a lot. I feel really strongly for the Wiggin sisters. I think that what they went through was simultaneously very awful and not something that they should have ever had to deal with. But also, that aside, just a very magical, almost transcendental thing that occurred where you can see this tapestry of this thing that somebody said in the 1930s, which was honestly probably just a bunch of bullcrap, that led to this event, that all culminated in these 3 girls genuinely becoming this this force in pop culture. And I find that to be oddly inspiring, even if the actual events of why it happened were obviously very abusive and should have never occurred. But that being said, I really just resonate with this story. And if anything, just go check out the Shaggs. Go listen to their albums. They're on Spotify. They're on YouTube. They're on every music platform. Philosophy of the World, Shaggs' own thing. Philosophy of the World has this special kind of like quality to it where obviously a lot of people are going to say, this is not good. But there's something to it when you listen to it that it elevates itself out of just being bad. And then Shaggs' own thing is honestly much better music, like technically. Like I think you'll listen to that and be like, oh, this sounds like indie music from the 2000s or something like that. I don't think it has quite the magic of Philosophy of the World, but if you want to hear more like technically better music, they actually got pretty good with Shaggs' own thing. So yeah, check out the albums. Tell me what you think about the video. Tell me about your favorite weird outsider music bands and artists and things like that that nobody else likes, but for some reason you connect with. I want to hear. Let me know in the comments.